Orcs Don't Babysit, Part 4, by Tony Well, a.k.a. Dragons After Dark. The morning passed into afternoon, and as the heat grew so did Crawled's fury. After an hour of sitting in the cage, the same two Tauren came back. The shaman fed the sprite darters some kind of slop, while the warrior kept an eye on the darters and Crawled. When one of the sprite darters got close enough to eat the food, the shaman reached forward and snatched it by the wings. Crawled inhaled sharply and moved to stop the Tauren. In response, the warrior brought up the cudgel as a warning. Crawled clenched his fists with a growl and settled back down, his stomach churning as the sound of crunching wings echoed in his mind. They took the darter, and the rest let out soft, mournful trills. The food didn't last long between the small horde of them, and they all quickly settled down, not having enough energy to do much else. The same sprite darter from before fluttered back over and curled up in his lap, a fine tremble along its delicate wings. It wasn't long after that a commotion arose from the western entrance of the camp. Tunla, a deep, harsh voice rang out. "Damn that thick-skulled ogre," the shaman swore as he passed the cage. "Let him through," he called out to the wall of Tauren ahead of him. They parted, and Crawled was struck with mild shock as he realized it might be the ogre that dropped Egg's egg. "Tunla, why you no give Korg stuffs?" the ogre asked as it stomped over to the shaman, who Crawled now assumed was Tunla. "Lower your voice," Tunla demanded. "And you don't get your stuffs until we get all the eggs. It no Korg's fault stupid orc and dumb gnome stole egg. Definitely the same ogre." "This orc?" Tunla asked, pointing to the cage. Korg lumbered over, then squinted down at Crawled. "Maybe. Bring him out," Tunla said. "What are the chances an orc steals one of our eggs? Then we find an orc snooping around the camp the next day. Seems like pretty good odds to me." Crawled gently shifted the sprite darter off his lap and stood up to walk to the front of the cage. He didn't put it past them to try and hurt the darters to get him to cooperate. Tunla opened the cage, yanked him out by his collar, and quickly shut the cage door. Crawled fell to a knee at Tunla's feet. When he stood, the shaman leaned down to get face to face with him, and his dark horns curved menacingly toward Crawled's face. "Where's our egg?" he asked. The Tauren's hot breath was right on Crawled's face, but he didn't look away when he asked, "Why? What are you do?" Tunla stood when Crawled had asked why, and nodded to the warrior. There was barely a breath of time between the nod and the warrior swinging the cudgel at Crawled's stomach. The blow interrupted Crawled's question. He'd done his best to redirect and block the attack, but it still doubled him over as pain exploded through his ribs and dislocated arm. He'd figured it was already injured. So what was a little more? And in that, he'd very much underestimated the little more, and had to bite down on a pained yell as he collapsed to his knees and clutched his arm. Tunla's knee wavered in Crawled's vision, and the Tauren's breath was hot on his ear. "Where is my egg?" Tunla asked, enunciating each word. "Why?" Crawled asked again between ragged breaths. Tunla sighed and stood. The next hit was across the middle of Crawled's back, and he fully collapsed on the ground. "Last time," Tunla said. Crawled's vision was blurry from the pain, but he could feel dirt and grass crawling over him, as larger rocks rolled over his limbs to hold him down. As the dirt crept toward his face, Tunla leaned over him once more. "Where's my egg?" "Hey!" a high-pitched, angry voice yelled. "Leave my friend alone." With Tunla distracted, the dirt loosened around Crawled. This allowed him to turn his head just enough to see Fixa as she raised her biggest wrench toward the grim totem. She had a smile of determination on her face and a contingent of Mohawky warriors at her back. "Get him!" she yelled. The Mohawky warriors roared in response, and clumps of dirt flew as their long strides ate the ground in the short distance between them and the grim totem. The earth elemental holding Crawled down quickly tumbled into nothingness and respawned in front of the Mohawky. The two lead warriors lowered their heads in tandem and headbutted the still-forming elemental. Its body exploded, sending a shower of rock shrapnel and earth at the scrambling grim totem. The momentum of the charge carried the Mohawky through the camp like fireballs through a dry grass field, and in a blink the two lead Tauren had engaged Tunla and the warrior in a fight. Crawled grunted in agony as he rolled away from the sharp, deadly hooves of the combatants. He came to rest against the cage and used it to work his way into a sitting position. Crawled watched as Fixa nimbly dodged the fighters and smacked a grim totem or two in the shins with her wrench for good measure. Before she made it to his side, Crawled, she cried, dropping to her knees in front of him and putting her wrench down at her side. Her face fell as she looked him over, before quickly shifting to a scowl as tears formed in her eyes. "It's not as bad as it looks," he said, trying to reassure her. Before she could argue with him about it, he continued, "Break the cage and let them out. If we have to beat a hasty retreat, I don't want them stuck here," he said, jerking his head back to indicate the darters. When she looked around him and into the cage, her eyes widened in horror. "Oh, my gears," she whispered. In a heartbeat, she grabbed her wrench and jumped to her feet. It didn't shock him that in one swing the lock on the cage shattered. Between her work in the shop and their gardening, he didn't envy anything or anyone on the other side of that wrench. She swung open the cage door and stepped back to let the darters out. They'd scattered to the back of the cage when she'd approached the door, but wasted no time flying out once their way was clear. Crawled expected them to take to the sky and never look back, but he underestimated them. The darters swarmed like angry bees, descending on the grim totem and harrying them from overhead while the Mohawkie took advantage of the distraction. After that, it wasn't long until the battle was over. Some of the grim totem escaped into the woods. Since Crawled did not see Tunla or Cord the ogre, that must have included them. But at least he could count the cudgel-wielding warrior among the dead. The rest who survived were bound, hobbled, and gagged, ready to be taken back to Mohawkie. "Don't worry," Fixa said to Crawled. "Chief Spirit Horn is here with a wagon. We'll get you loaded up and back to Mohawkie so a healer can look at you. And the wagon will come in handy," Droth said as he walked up. "We found where they were keeping our stolen supplies." He turned so they could see a couple of the warriors pulling out crates, baskets, and barrels from a hut. "Our supply line is being attacked by Grim Totem. We don't know why they've started now, but who knows with them. That's probably what the ogre meant by stuffs," Crawled said. "Ogre," Spirit Horn asked as he walked up. Crawled explained what he overheard, then said, "Sounds like the ogre is hunting the darters and their eggs and trading them for some of your supplies." With that, all their eyes turned to watch the darters. Half had flown off once the fighting was over and the grim totem were secured. The other half remained, landing on the shoulders of the warriors and gladly taking the food offered to them from the recovered supplies. A single grim-faced Tauren came out from one of the huts with something small wrapped in a blanket, and she approached Spirit Horn with it. Spirit Horn lifted the edge of the blanket and let out a sad sigh. "Put them in the wagon. We will not dishonor them by burying them here." The warrior nodded. She carried the darter over to the wagon and placed it gingerly under the seat up front. A lump lodged in Crawled's throat and his chest tightened at the sight. Maybe if he'd done more to delay Tunla from taking the darter, Fixa and the others would have shown up and the darter would still be alive. Crawled paused on the thought and took a deep breath. He'd traveled such roads of regret before, and they remained as treacherous as ever. Still, it would be a while before he could turn from such a path in his mind and heart, and he said a prayer to the darter's ancestors to guide its spirit. A darter fluttered down to his lap, and it had the same markings as the one who'd sat with him in the cage. It looked up at him with a familiar pair of luminous, violet eyes, and panic ripped through Crawled. "Have you seen eggs?" he asked, straining to keep his voice and movements under control to not scare the darter. "They're in Mohawkie being fawned over by those who remain behind," Fixa said with a laugh. "I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't want to leave with us." The thought sent a pang through Crawled's chest, but his breathing eased. "It's funny. Right about the time I realized your Crawled boot tracker hadn't moved for a while, I headed to Mohawkie to wait for you. I figured if you didn't show up soon I'd ask them for help. But when I got there they took me to Spirit Horn and Eggs was already there without you. That was when I knew something was wrong. I had the tracker coordinates, and the scouts said they'd seen Grim Totem in the area. So everyone rallied and we came to save you," she said, pumping a fist into the air with a triumphant grin. "A tracker in my boot, huh?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She crossed her arms over her chest and lifted her chin. "It saved you, didn't it? I'm more concerned about my foot being blown up," she sputtered in indignation. He chuckled tiredly and held up a hand with the arm he could still move. "I'm mostly joking. Thank you for saving me." "Of course," she said, mollified. "Let's get that shoulder set before we do anything else," Spirit Horn said, kneeling at Crawled's side. "We might not be able to because of the swelling, but it'll make the ride much more enjoyable if we can. A worried Fixa watched on, biting the inside of her cheek, and the darter nuzzled Crawled's good hand as though trying to comfort him. When Spirit Horn popped Crawled's shoulder back in, the relief was so sharp he nearly melted into a puddle on the ground. Another warrior walked up and saluted Spirit Horn. "The wagon is loaded. Good work. Have the warriors get the prisoners up and tie them together. Hopefully, the walk to Mohawkie will give the help from Thunder Bluff time to get here." At Crawled's questioning look he elaborated, "I received a vision last night that it would be necessary, but I wasn't shown why at the time." The warrior walked away to convey Spirit Horn's orders, and the chief turned to Droth. "Help him to the wagon. I'll see to his injuries myself." As Droth helped Crawled up, the darter fluttered over to Fixa and settled on her shoulders. Her eyes lit up as it nuzzled against her cheek. "I didn't know you were a healer," Fixa said to Spirit Horn, as she brushed a finger along the darter's jaw. Spirit Horn watched the exchange with a smile. "I served as one of High Chieftain Cairn's shamans for many years before I became the chief of Mohawkie. Wow, I bet you have lots of stories." He considered her for a moment before nodding. "I do. I'll tell you some as we ride back." "Awesome," she said, and the two of them headed to the wagon together. Droth helped Crawled up. After Crawled confirmed he could walk unaided, the two followed at a slower pace. "I am sorry," Droth said. "When Fixa told us something happened while you were hunting, I felt responsible." Crawled shook his head. "I was going hunting anyway. In the end, it means more to me that you listened to her and helped when you could have told her to go away, since she's not allowed there without me. Thank you for that. Still, I will see to it you have that chicken coop, and if you two ever need help you need only ask." "Of course," Crawled agreed. Once they reached the wagon, Crawled climbed into the back of the wagon with Droth's help. There was just enough room for Fixa to sit on one bench, Spirit Horn on the other, and Crawled in between, his legs dangling over the back of the wagon. Crawled leaned back against a stack of secured crates and closed his eyes. When everyone and everything was secure, they headed out, the rocking of the wagon, and Spirit Horn's voice as he told the stories in combination with the soothing shamanic magic lulled Crawled into semi-consciousness. It made the ride pass by quicker than Crawled expected. As they pulled into Mohawkie, they had indeed taken long enough that a group of Thunder Bluff warriors were there to take the Grim Totem into custody. After the three of them got down from the wagon, they headed to the main hut. Crawled went inside first and saw Shindra and Lorana doing exactly what Fixa had said, fawning over eggs. When the darter saw him, it gave its happy little chirrup croak and flew over to him. Crawled held out his hands for them to land on, and when their tiny feet touched down on his palms, he hugged Eggs to his shoulder, being extra careful of their wings. "Heya, Eggs," Fixa said from behind him. "Look, another sprite darter." There was a joyful croak from behind him, and Eggs scrambled to the top of Crawled's shoulder before jumping off. Crawled turned around slowly so as not to bump or step on Eggs, and saw them nuzzling and chirping with the darter who'd stayed with him in the cage. And after, Fixa gasped, "Is that your mommy or daddy, Eggs?" Now the darter cuddling with him in the cage made more sense. They could smell their child on him. "Seems so," Crawled said. "Well, while the two of them get reacquainted, let's finish your healing," Spirit Horn said, moving them off to the side of the hut. They sat down on a couple of soft, woven blankets, and Spirit Horn cast his shamanic magic. The green glow of his hands caught the attention of the sprite darters, who fluttered over together and landed on Crawled's lap. Then they began making long croaks with occasional rhythmic chirps. "Are they singing?" Fixa asked, her eyes going wide as she knelt next to him and looked down at the darters. "I do believe they are," Spirit Horn murmured, "and I think they are also helping with your healing." When they began, the magic flowed much easier and became more powerful. Crawled considered this for a moment before whispering, "Thank you." Eggs chirruped and gently butted their head against Crawled's hand before continuing to sing, and everyone present sank into the soothing melody of the darters. Epilogue. 3 days later, Droth and Faye were visiting to set up the chicken coop. Fixa was in her workshop, furiously working on the surprise she'd began after their first trip to Mohawkie. Eggs, and the darter they assumed was Eggs' parent whom they'd named Henny, were culling the bug population around the lake. The two darters had remained in Mohawkie with the other, injured darters but were visiting along with Droth and Faye. Crawled was outside, getting lunch ready for everyone by cooking the boar he'd taken down with Droth the day before. Between Spirit Horn's healing and the Song of the Darters, he was feeling good as new. Krald set aside some choice, raw pieces off to the side for the Darters, just in case they were still hungry after all the bugs. Dappled sun danced along the ground, as the breeze that never seemed to travel below the upper canopy moved the leaves high above. The warmth of the afternoon and fire were making Krald sweat, but it didn't bother him as much as it might have otherwise. Droth and Faye walked up to the fire pit and sat down on one of the makeshift seats Fixa had welded together for them. They did so gingerly at first, then slowly settled all their weight with a sigh. Krald passed them a couple of bottles of brew he'd purchased from Shindra. "Thank you," Droth said, and took a long pull of the drink. "No problem. How goes the coop?" Krald asked, turning the meat before facing the Tauren again. "It'll do to keep a few hens," Faye said. She was just a hair shorter than Droth, and her tan fur was dappled with white spots. Her pale horns were short, and her violet eyes had a gentleness in them. "What kind of chicken do you want?" Krald gave her a blank stare. "The chicken kind?" There was a small pause before both Tauren burst into lows of laughter. Krald muttered as his cheeks deepened to the color of juniper, and he turned away to tend the meat. "Don't worry, I'll introduce you to my sister. She'll know better what would work best for you." She reassured him. "Thank you," he said. After that, they killed time with small talk until the meat was finished. Krald headed over to the workshop to let Fixa know the food was ready, and as the two went back to the fire pit, the Darters joined them. Right about then, Spirit Horn crested the hill with another Tauren he didn't recognize. "Welcome, Chief. Care for some boar?" Fixa asked him as she waved. Spirit Horn gave a single wave in return and shook his head. "No. I'm just here to introduce you both to Nita from the Cenarian Circle. She's here to check on all the Darters." Nita was about Spirit Horn's age, with gray distributed throughout her pale, sunrise yellow fur. Her horns curled gracefully away from her face, and were ivory, while her eyes were a dark gray. "So you're here to see Henny and eggs," Fixa said with a smile. Nita raised an eyebrow, and looked between Spirit Horn and Fixa. "You named what are basically soldiers of the Emerald Dream, Eggs and Henny." "Well, yeah," she said. "Eggs is actually scrambled eggs because Krald said we should eat the egg instead of trying to hatch it. But I didn't let him," she said with a sharp nod at Nita's horrified expression. Krald had a sudden desire for the earth elemental of the grim totem shaman to swallow him whole. Droth, Faye, and Spirit Horn were barely hanging on to their composure, shaking and tearing up from suppressed laughter. "And Henny, because hens lay eggs." "How very clever," Nita said. The dam broke, and the other Tauren burst out laughing, while Krald shook his head. "What?" Fixa asked, looking between all of them. "It makes sense. Of course it does," Nita reassured her. "And I'm sure if they didn't like the names they would have told you." Fixa looked over to the Darters. Eggs was on Krald's shoulder, and Henny was on Faye's. "You two can talk, and you didn't tell us?" The Darters tilted their heads and raised their feathery antennae in unison. Based on everyone's expressions, all hearts were officially melted. They rarely speak, and the wild ones even less so. "I am sure they meant no slight," Nita said. "Oh, that makes sense," Fixa agreed. Krald asked something he'd been wondering since the Grim Totem had thrown him in the cage. Speaking of the Darters, why were the Grim Totem capturing them? "We've had reports of it for a while, but we're not entirely sure," Nita admitted. "Our best guess is they are trying to somehow exploit the Darters' connection to the Emerald Dream. Many enemies would gain much from having this knowledge." Krald wasn't a druid, but the thought of any of the enemies he'd fought over the years having access to such power sent a chill over him. "That being said, we appreciate your help in thwarting them." "Of course," Fixa said. "We were happy to help. But you're not just here to check on the Darters and thank us, are you?" Krald asked. He was pretty sure the closest Cenarian Circle post was in Desolus, so it wasn't just an axe's throw away. "No," Nita admitted. "I'm here to see if Eggs and Henny would like to join the other Darters in the Cenarian wildlands with me." Krald's gut twisted and his heart ached. However, Eggs hunkered down further on Krald's shoulder and nuzzled their face into his neck. And when he looked over to Henny, they were doing the same with Faye. "Well, I suppose I have my answer," Nita said with a smile. "Thank you for having me," she said to Krald and Fixa, before turning to Spirit Horn. I'll be heading back with the other darters once we return to Mohawkie. Of course, Spirit Horn rumbled in return. Why don't you stay for some food? Fixa suggested. We have more than enough. Nita's eyebrows rose. Truly? You would not mind? Not at all, Crawled said. I'll grab a bench from the workshop and more drinks. Are Cenarian Circle druids allowed to drink? She laughed. I'd like to see them stop me. He smiled in return and headed inside to grab everything. After a few trips, they were all settled around the pit, enjoying beer and boar, and telling various stories of their lives. The moon was high overhead when the Tauren rose to leave. Eggs had long ago drifted to sleep on Crawled's lap, while Henny had done the same under his chair. Nita came over. She was smiling, her features soft in the firelight. I am sorry you endured pain, but it gladdens my heart they were reunited. Mine too. If it would not trouble you, I would like to visit again to see them, anytime. Wait, Fixa said, jumping up. Before you all leave, I have something for you. She ran to her shop and came back out with a box in each hand. They were made of black metal with handles to carry them. She set them down on the ground in front of Spirit Horn, then flipped a big switch on top. Nothing happened. Thank you? Spirit Horn ventured. Fixa pumped a fist in the air. Yes, I was worried you wouldn't be able to use it because I didn't know what a Tauren's hearing range is, but it works. Eggs and Henny had stirred when she flipped the switch, and their antennae were perked up. Oh, she said, and switched the box off. I'll need to adjust it so it doesn't mess with darters. Sorry. Her grin was sheepish to the two darters, who shook their heads and laid back down. What are they? Spirit Horn asked. It's a scoundrel's curse auditory repelling equipment or a scare device. It sends out sounds only the gnolls can hear and darters, sorry, to keep them away from Mohawkie. These little boxes can stop the attacks? Droth asked, leaning down to inspect one of them. That's the idea. I'll need to fix it so it doesn't bother the darters, and then I'll need to field test it to make sure it doesn't produce regrettable results. Like? Droth asked. It's not going to blow up, is it? One exploding robot and that's all they remember, she sighed. But to answer your question, it could make them flee, or it could send them into a rage. The Tauren took a step back and Crawled grimaced. I would almost rather have it explode. That way we know for sure it would deter them, Faye said. Fixa harumphed when everyone agreed. Anyone can make a grenade, and this won't cause collateral damage, she argued. It is a very fine idea. Spirit Horn cut in. And I look forward to the results of your tests and seeing them in action myself. Her eyes lit up. Really? Spirit Horn nodded. Anything that can help keep the village safe is welcome. Fine, fine. Faye relented at his words and Fix's smug expression. Well, it's time for us to be off, Spirit Horn said. Thank you for the food and drink. Can Henny and Eggs stay the night? Fixa asked. He gave a snort of laughter. The darters are free to go where they please. Yay, she cheered. Everyone said their good nights, and Crawled made sure the fire was completely out before they headed toward their respective shacks. Though Fixa was disappointed when both the darters chose to go with Crawled, they gave her goodnight nuzzles and left her with a sleepy smile before heading inside with him. He washed up before laying down in bed. The darters quickly found their preferred sleeping arrangements, with Eggs curled up on his pillow next to his head and Henny across his legs. It didn't take any of them long to fall asleep, and it was the best sleep Crawled ever had.
Hey everyone! Don't forget to check out Matt's website in the description. If you'd like me to do the first Crawled and Fixa story, Bugs Don't Count, let me know.